The warning has always been brutal: challenge the West and die. Africa knows this script too well. Patrice Lumumba silenced after barely 2 months in office. Thomas Sankara cut down after only 4 years. Muammar Gaddafi executed before the eyes of the world for daring to dream of a currency that would make Africa one. History carved in blood, a warning etched into every generation. Those who resist the old masters pay the highest price. And yet, even in the face of such a violent legacy, a new figure has risen. From a dusty barracks in a landlocked nation that much of the world barely noticed, a 34-year-old captain stood before the cameras in September 2022 and declared an end to submission. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, and his voice has carried across a continent. Is he a liberator rewriting Africa's destiny, or just another name fated to be crushed by the weight of empire? Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point in history. Subscribe now and stand with the story unfolding before your eyes. Burkina Faso, a small landlocked nation in the heart of West Africa, has long been trapped between a colonial past and an uncertain future. To outsiders, it is a country marked on the map by its borders, but to its people, it is a land of contradictions: gold beneath the soil, yet poverty on the surface; resilience in spirit, yet insecurity at every corner. By the mid-2010s, the statistics told a cruel story. Despite producing over 60 tons of gold every year by 2020, Burkina Faso was ranked 182nd out of 189 on the Human Development Index. Life expectancy stood at barely 61 years, and only a third of the population had access to clean water. The rivers of wealth flowed north to European markets through companies like Endeavour Mining and Rox Gold, while the communities above the mines remained locked in deprivation. The harvest of the land was not for those who tilled it, but numbers only tell half the truth. The other half was written in fear. From 2015 onwards, the shadow of terrorism crept deeper into the Sahel. Armed groups, strengthened by weapons that poured into the region after NATO's war in Libya, began striking Burkina Faso. In January 2016, the splendid hotel in Ouagadougou became the site of carnage, 30 people dead in a single night. Soon, schools were shuttered, markets attacked, mosques desecrated. Entire regions turned into no-go zones. Teachers abandoned classrooms, health workers left their clinics, families fled their villages. By 2024, over 2 million Burkinabè, nearly 1 in 10, had been driven from their homes. For Ibrahim Traoré, then a young officer stationed in the north, this was not just a national crisis, it was personal. He saw comrades fall in ambushes, while French forces stationed nearby focused more on safeguarding mining installations than defending villages. He watched foreign advisors make strategic decisions, while local commanders were sidelined. It was a pattern he could no longer ignore. Security plans designed abroad, wealth exported abroad, and sovereignty suspended in the very land that shed its blood for freedom decades earlier. When Roch-Marc Christian Kabore became president in 2015, there was hope, but his reliance on international aid and foreign guidance only deepened the frustration. By 2021, protests filled the streets of Ouagadougou demanding his resignation. The people cried for protection, for dignity, for leadership that would place Burkina Faso above foreign dictates. Yet the response was the same. More cooperation agreements, more foreign advisors, but no peace. In January 2022, Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba seized power in a coup. For many, including Captain Traoré, it seemed like the dawn of change. At last, a leader in uniform who promised to restore security and dignity. But hope quickly soured. Within months, Damiba was repeating the same script, relying on French military advice, embracing aid packages, and preserving the old ties of dependence. The violence raged on, and the people grew restless again. The breaking point came in late September 2022. During a security briefing, Traoré watched Damiba defer to French advisors for decisions about Burkinabè territory. To him, it was the final betrayal, another leader in power, but the same puppet strings controlling the nation. That night, he gathered fellow officers who had lost friends, family, and faith. Together, they decided that enough was enough. On September 30th, as dawn broke over Ouagadougou, gunfire echoed near the presidential palace. Explosions shook the capital. By morning, Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared on national television. With calm words and steady eyes, he announced the removal of Damiba and the birth of a new order. Burkina Faso had witnessed its second coup in 9 months, but this time it was different. The youngest head of state in the world, just 34 years old, had declared himself ready to rewrite his nation's story. The coup was not only a seizure of power, it was a symbolic rupture. For the first time in decades, a leader rose not by promising to satisfy foreign ambassadors, but by vowing to speak directly to his people. Instead of asking for recognition from Paris, Brussels, or Washington, Traoré spoke to Ouagadougou, to the villages in the north, to the displaced, to the soldiers at the front. It was a moment that electrified the continent and unsettled the West. The question lingered in every mind. Was this the beginning of renewal, or the first step into deeper chaos? But the coup was only the spark. The fire came after. The spark of September became a blaze in December. In one of his first decisive acts as head of state, Captain Ibrahim Traoré ordered the departure of all French troops from Burkina Faso. For decades, their bases had stood as both a military shield for European economic interests and a psychological reminder of subordination. With one command, he tore down that symbol. "This land is ours," he told his people. "African security does not require European supervision." The words ignited the streets. In Ouagadougou, crowds waved flags, young men chanted songs of defiance, and women carried portraits of their ancestors who had fought colonial rule. It was as if a wound buried deep in the national memory had been touched and healed, if only for a moment. But pride was not the only reaction. Western capitals trembled. The expulsion of French troops was not just a local decision, it was a challenge to an entire system of control that had operated since independence. To lose a foothold in Burkina Faso risked setting a precedent across the Sahel. Traoré knew the dangers. You cannot dismantle an old order without building a new one. As French forces departed, Russian military advisors began arriving, offering training and equipment. Chinese companies were invited to bid on infrastructure projects long monopolized by European firms. Iranian specialists shared knowledge in agriculture and food processing. To his critics, this was simply swapping one dependency for another. To his supporters, it was diversification, proof that Burkina Faso could choose its partners freely, no longer bound to a single master. At home, Traoré's rhetoric tapped into veins of long-suppressed pride. He spoke of dignity, sovereignty, and African rebirth. He invoked the names of Sankara and Lumumba not as martyrs, but as unfinished promises. His speeches carried into villages where the voice of leadership had rarely reached. He told his people they were heirs of kingdoms and empires that had thrived long before colonial borders were drawn. "We are not beggars," he said. "We are builders of nations." The resonance was powerful, not only in Burkina Faso. Across the Sahel, a continental echo began to stir. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta raised the same call for sovereignty. In Niger, General Abdourahmane Tidiane began questioning uranium deals with France and the presence of American bases. What began as a solitary coup in Ouagadougou was transforming into a movement that spanned borders. By 2023, the three leaders had formalized their cooperation through the Alliance of Sahel States. They shared intelligence, conducted joint operations against insurgents, and discussed economic integration projects designed to reduce dependence on former colonial powers. ECOWAS, alarmed by the defiance, threatened sanctions. But instead of retreating, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger accelerated discussions of withdrawing from the organization altogether. The symbolism was unmistakable. Three nations standing shoulder to shoulder, daring to say no. For a generation of Africans who had grown up watching their leaders bow to external demands, this was intoxicating. It was not only politics, it was poetry, a narrative of resistance written in real time. Yet even as the flames of defiance burned bright, the shadows grew longer. Critics warned that aligning with Russia, China, and Iran was not sovereignty, but another bargain with new powers. Western governments condemned the extension of military rule, portraying Traoré as another strongman cloaked in revolutionary rhetoric. International organizations raised alarms about human rights and democratic backsliding. The media in Paris, London, and Washington painted headlines in bold. Traoré extends military rule until 2029. Few mentioned why. The decades of interference had left institutions too fragile for instant democracy. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, the narrative was different. Every sanction, every condemnation, every headline that sought to delegitimize him was seen as proof that he was walking the right path. If they hate him, one young supporter said, it means he is fighting for us. For Traoré, the coup had been the spark. The expulsion of French troops was the fire. But the flames were now spreading far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. And when three nations said no together, the echo reached every Western capital. The fire of defiance lit a torch of pride, but it also cast long shadows across Burkina Faso. For ordinary people, the revolution was not only measured in speeches or ceremonies, but in the daily struggle to survive. By 2024, the violence had not diminished. It had intensified. Militant attacks rose sharply. The death toll, already devastating at 3,600 lives lost in 2022, climbed to over 6,300 just 2 years later. Entire stretches of the north and east slipped beyond government control. Roads became perilous, villages emptied, and markets stood silent. For the families crammed into displacement camps, the speeches of sovereignty were stirring. But food, medicine, and safety were still scarce. 2 million Burkinabè were living away from their homes, 1 in every 10 citizens. Teachers still feared returning to classrooms, clinics remained abandoned, and agricultural cycles were broken. The land that had once been the pride of subsistence farming now struggled to feed its own people. Dignity alone could not fill an empty stomach. The economic strain was just as brutal. With foreign investment drying up, major projects slowed to a crawl. Youth unemployment surged, and educated professionals, engineers, doctors, teachers, began leaving for safer jobs in neighboring countries. It was a paradox Traoré could not ignore. While he spoke of pride and independence, the very people meant to build that future were slipping away. The revolution was inspiring, but inspiration does not pave roads or power hospitals. And yet, for many, these hardships were not proof of failure, but of authenticity. Revolutions are never painless, Traoré told his people. Breaking chains cuts the skin. To his supporters, the rising costs were a sign that he was shaking the foundations of a system built on dependency. If it were easy, they argued, it would have been done long ago. The suffering was not meaningless. It was evidence that change was real. The government sought to address the crisis by renegotiating mining contracts, demanding a greater share of revenues for the state. New processing plants were planned to keep more value at home rather than shipping raw ore abroad. Agricultural reforms promised to reduce food imports and make the nation more self-sufficient. But these measures, bold as they were, took time. And time was what ordinary families lacked. Opponents seized on the contradictions. How could a nation claim sovereignty while still leaning on Russian weapons, Chinese infrastructure, and Iranian expertise? How could it promise dignity when millions were displaced and poverty deepened? Western critics called his policies reckless, painting him as a dangerous populist risking his people's future for ideology. Yet in Ouagadougou and beyond, his words still resonated. To many, he was not another politician making excuses. He was a soldier speaking from the trenches, a man who had bled with his troops and refused to bow to foreign powers. His honesty about the costs gave him credibility. "We are building not for today," he declared, "but for tomorrow." That tomorrow was uncertain. Would history remember him as another failed revolutionary, or as the man who dared to endure the storms so his nation might walk upright? His supporters already speak of Ibrahim Traoré's legacy even before his story is finished. They see in him not just a leader of Burkina Faso, but the voice of a generation unwilling to surrender dignity for comfort. But could his legacy survive the storms he had unleashed? The coup in Ouagadougou did not remain a local affair. Its tremors traveled swiftly across boardrooms, embassies, and international organizations. For Paris, it was a direct humiliation. The expulsion of French troops cut more than military ties. It severed a psychological chain that had bound West Africa for decades. European think tanks published alarmist reports warning of a contagion effect spreading across the Sahel. Brussels soon followed with sanctions, targeting officials aligned with the new government. Washington expressed concern about authoritarian tendencies and democratic backsliding. The language was familiar, a script used whenever leaders in the global South defied established interests. Reports from international organizations questioned press freedom, human rights, and the extension of military rule. Headlines were blunt. Traoré extends military transition until 2029. Rarely did they explain why. That institutions had been eroded by decades of dependency, that rushing into elections might simply recycle the same elite who had bowed to foreign powers. COAS, the regional bloc once seen as a guarantor of stability, threatened sanctions against Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The response was startling. Rather than retreat, the three nations declared a deepening of their alliance, even considering withdrawal from ECOWAS itself. It was a diplomatic rebellion as striking as any coup, a refusal to accept punishment from institutions that many saw as extensions of external influence. The West framed Traoré as a populist strongman, but across Africa, his image was different. In Pan-African conferences, he drew standing ovations. In villages and cities far from Ouagadougou, young people spoke of him as proof that leaders could look Europe in the eye and say no. His voice, whether admired or feared, had become impossible to ignore. This clash of narratives is not only about one leader, it is about competing visions of Africa's future. For Western capitals, stability is measured by open markets, predictable contracts, and governments that defer to partners. For Traoré and his allies, stability is meaningless without sovereignty, dignity, and control over resources. His supporters call it a revolution. His critics call it regression. The truth may lie somewhere in between, a turbulent experiment in reimagining power. What is clear is that Traoré does not speak only of the present moment. His words stretch forward, framing a horizon he calls Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a vision where Africa's destiny is written in its own ink, not dictated from abroad. Whether realistic or utopian, it has captured imaginations across the continent. The battle was no longer only for Burkina Faso, it was for the story of Africa itself. Every revolution carries within it two futures, one of triumph, one of collapse. For Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso, both possibilities remain alive. The road ahead is as treacherous as the one behind, yet it is also lined with opportunities. If his experiment succeeds, if he can deliver security while reclaiming economic sovereignty, Burkina Faso could stand as the proof that Africa can chart its own course. The model of reliance on aid, of policies designed in foreign capitals, would face its greatest challenge. A small, landlocked country might inspire an entire continent. Future textbooks could point to Ouagadougou not as the site of endless coups, but as the birthplace of renewal. But failure would carry consequences just as great. If insecurity deepens, if the economy stalls, if promises of sovereignty dissolve into hardship, then critics will declare vindication. They will argue that Burkina Faso's experiment proves the necessity of Western tutelage, that Africa cannot govern itself without guidance. A collapse here could poison the hopes of a generation, fueling the old narratives of incapacity that have long justified foreign control. This is why the stakes are so high. Traoré's speeches resonate because they tap into more than national pride. They awaken continental memory. He tells Burkinabè that their ancestors built empires before colonization, and Africans across the continent hear echoes of their own history. From Bamako to Nairobi, from Niamey to Dakar, young people are listening. They see in his defiance a mirror of their own frustration, a refusal to be defined by the past. The path forward will not be smooth. New partnerships with Russia, China, or Iran bring their own conditions. Building domestic industries takes years, not months. Security requires not only weapons, but reconciliation, governance, and trust. Yet the very difficulty of the journey may become its greatest strength. Easy victories fade quickly. Hard-won progress endures. In the long sweep of African history, revolutions are rarely judged in the moment. They are judged by the legacy they leave. Will Burkina Faso's struggle mark the dawn of an African century, or will it be remembered as another rebellion crushed by pressure and contradiction? That verdict remains unwritten. For now, one thing is certain. The young captain who stepped before the cameras in 2022 has already altered the conversation. He has made sovereignty, dignity, and pride the vocabulary of politics once more. Whether this chapter ends in glory or in ashes, the continent will not forget that, for a time, a voice from Ouagadougou dared to tell the world that Africa's destiny belongs to Africa. The question remains, will this be remembered as a revolution or just another rebellion? In the story of nations, moments arise when a single voice echoes far beyond its borders. For Burkina Faso, that voice is Ibrahim Traoré. He did not emerge from the polished halls of diplomacy, but from the dust of conflict, carrying with him the weight of fallen comrades and the cries of displaced families. His rise is more than a political event. It is a reminder that Africa's struggle for dignity is not over. The journey has been brutal. The death toll has risen. Communities have been uprooted, and economic hardship presses heavily on the people. Yet amid the pain, there is an awakening. Traoré speaks not only of policy, but of pride, not only of survival, but of sovereignty. He calls his people to remember who they were before conquest and to imagine who they might yet become. This is where the measure of his story will lie, in the Ibrahim Traoré legacy. If he can endure the storms, if his reforms take root, Burkina Faso may one day stand as the seedbed of a continental rebirth. If he falters, his name may be added to the long list of leaders who challenged empire only to be broken. But even then, the dream he has ignited will not easily be extinguished. For his supporters, the horizon stretches toward Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, an Africa that walks upright, trading on equal terms, building on its own soil, trusting its own people. It is an ambitious dream, perhaps even utopian, but it has already reshaped the imagination of a generation. History is not written in comfort, but in struggle. The question for Burkina Faso is not whether the path will be hard, but whether it will be worth it. And the answer may not be found in 1 year or even 1 decade, but in the enduring mark of the revolution now unfolding. When future generations look back, they may say this was the moment when Africa's voice broke through the noise of empire. Or they may say it was a mischance, a dream deferred. What is certain is that the name Ibrahim Traoré will remain, not just as a man, but as a question posed to an entire continent. Do you believe this struggle will end in freedom or in failure? Share your thoughts, subscribe, and stand with us as the story continues to unfold.